Yeah, it's interesting.
It's a fascinating thing. It's the only church like it in Lancaster County.
It makes sense in a way because with humans you have to look inside yourself before you can discover. Everything from the outside is from the outside.
Yeah,
And to know what you as a person and as an organization really want, you gotta reflect.
right,
Yeah.
right.
So that's great. It's a great example.
You named it, actually.
Evening. Good evening. Hello. Hello. Hi. Hi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Alicia Ferrari. I think it's cutting. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Thank you. I'll just go without. Okay, there are refreshments, there's water and some snacks out in the cafe for you. If you need the restrooms, just follow the hall down and they are on the left. Before we get started, we wanted just to take a moment of silence for the victims of September 11th. Okay, and I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this evening's event. If a member of each of these organizations could please stand up. We have our co-sponsors this evening, Power Interfaith Lancaster, Wrightsville Presbyterian Church, and Grandview Church York. Thank you, everyone. We want to welcome Dr. Greg Carey this evening, giving a talk on Christian nationalism, why it's dangerous to democracy and the church. If you have any questions that come up, please write them on your index card and we will get those to him for answering later this evening. One more thing to mention, the church and Wrightsville for All are hosting Fight Hunger Fall Fest November 9th from 11 until 2 o'clock. So we will be raising cash donations and also collecting non-perishable food and hygiene items that will benefit the Eastern York Food Pantry. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and we'll get started.
That's me? Oh, I'm good. Thank you. Evening, everyone. My name is Greg Carey, and it is a joy to be here. I am grateful to Wrightsville Presbyterian and Grandview and Power Interfaith for helping this conversation happen. I'd like to say a few words about what to expect and maybe a little what not to expect, and we'll hop right into the conversation. So I've been talking about Christian nationalism publicly for about 2.5 years now. I've been alarmed about it a good chunk of my life. And thank you, Steve. I should thank Steve because Steve has my back. I want to let you know that I will refer from time to time to resources that I've gathered in this time. That QR code, which will show up again at the end of the presentation, is a link to a bibliography if any of you feel like being nerds about it. I am not an expert on Christian nationalism. I'm a New Testament scholar. I'm a part-time pastor. What I have done is I've tried very hard to be in touch with the experts on Christian nationalism and to keep up with them on social media and to read their things and watch their things and listen to their things. So I don't pretend to be the person doing the research at all. I also want to note that we're in the space of a church. And this presentation is not a partisan presentation. I'm not here to recommend a political candidate or party. However, there's no way to talk about Christian nationalism without issues related to politicians and politics being part of the conversation. And that's a very fine line that makes me uncomfortable, but I'm going to try to keep it. I'll put it this way. People who I treasure a lot right now are conservatives who are alarmed by Christian nationalism, because that puts them in uncomfortable places and they're showing a great deal of courage. And so you will not hear me talking about conservative versus liberal in any context in this conversation. I ask when I do these talks if I can have 90 minutes. And I'm not going to talk at you for 90 minutes. I am for 60. And so it's a long time, but I have found, and the folks I've interacted with doing this dozens of times have said, this is about the right thing. And so I just wanted to give you that fair warning and express my gratitude to you. There will be time for Q&A toward the end, and as I understand it, we'll have cards for you to write questions on, and then we can interact through that. So, what will I be talking about? Christian nationalism is a term that's been out, but we often use it, hear it in the media without any kind of definition. What is it? Where does it come from? How does it work? What do we need to know about how it works, what it's done, and what it's doing in ways that affect the health of our society, and, for those of us who are Christian, our witness to the gospel, and how should Christians respond? So let's just start by defining it. You often hear people who are Christian nationalists say, oh, they just made up that term to attack us. That term hasn't existed for long. They just made it up. It doesn't have any real meaning. Actually, just do a Google Scholar search on the term Christian nationalism, and you'll see scholarship going back well over 50 years on the subject. And when you hear experts talking about it, they tend to come around. In fact, I just saw an interview with a historian named Randall Balmer who said, if you're a Christian nationalist, you believe at least two of these three things. And I saw it this morning. It was very close to these three things. So simply, what is Christian nationalism? It's a belief that the United States as a nation has a special relationship with God. That is, that God has blessed this nation in a particular way, and in return wants us to live out a vocation that God gives the United States to be a Christian nation. That's the first part. The second is, so therefore the United States should declare that it has been a Christian nation and is a Christian nation from the start. So there's a matter of identity. And then third, there's a claim that the United States should govern itself according to Christian principles. And here's where I want to make the key point. I don't want to be part of a society that's governed by any particular religion's principles. I am a Christian, right? I'm a professional Christian, which makes me feel creepy, but it's true. And yet, I don't trust any religious tradition in a pluralistic society to manage it for the rest of us. However, it's not just that. I was speaking with a black pastor today from York County who said they claim to speak for us and they don't speak for us. In other words, they claim when they say Christian values to represent Christianity as a whole, but as we'll see, that's not the case. And if you check into it, different Christian groups have social statements on all kinds of issues. Climate, environmental justice, labor issues, peacemaking, militarism, you name it. A lot of Christian churches have statements. Guess what? We have different opinions. And so to take the position that you speak for Christianity is also problematic. That's why what I really want to point out is, and you see me introducing a word, white Christian nationalism, which doesn't mean all Christian nationalists are white, but it means whiteness has a lot to do with Christian nationalism, and I'll make the case, is an attempt really to take a particular political agenda and baptize that agenda as Christian. Because Christian nationalists tend to agree on their politics, and it's a very narrow stream of politics and a very narrow stream of Christianity. So what I'm saying is, yes, this claim that this is, was, has been, should always be a Christian nation defines what Christian nationalism is, but it functions as leverage for political power. Where might you be seeing it lately to think about it? Well, lot of anti-LGBTQ activism and policies, especially around education, but in the workplace and in other contexts as well. A lot of activity in schools and libraries to ban books, to attack woke curricula or critical race theory or diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. In other words, a lot of things around race and ethnicity. A lot of language about parental rights, the argument that parents should determine what their children learn in school. As the child of a career public school English teacher, I'm trying to imagine her managing 150 parents a semester, telling them each one what that needs to look like. A lot of language about religious liberty and a lot of money spent on language around religious liberty, which essentially means the liberty to impose their agenda on other people, right? It's not religious liberty for everyone, it's religious liberty for them to exercise their faith in ways that, for example, you're a landlord and there's a same-sex couple that wants to rent an apartment in your property, and you say, no, that violates my Christian principles. It doesn't violate your civil rights. Or you say, I want to carry a semi-automatic weapon into Walmart, and I have that right. You don't have the right to say no because you feel unsafe because of that. A lot of efforts to put Christianity in the public square, Ten Commandments laws, chaplains instead of school counselors in the schools, monuments, official language of the country, lots of efforts to retell the history of the United States in such a way that it's promoting the idea that the founders of this country, and you will hear these people do it, they'll say they all were Christians, they all had theological educations, which isn't true. So we're seeing it all over the place, but it doesn't always come named as Christian nationalism. And that is what it is. What does it look like? Now, I don't mean this in the way of the person in the slide in particular. I really don't. You may think, no, he's just being sneaky, but let me explain. The moment when this photograph was taken was the summer of 2020. It was an election year. It was also a year of racial unrest after the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. That unrest happened in Washington. There was property damage. You see, this is St. John's Episcopal Church. You see that it's boarded up. At the time, then President Donald Trump was speaking out against the protest, and his Secretary of Defense at the time he said, can't we just shoot them in the leg? That is, to use the military to shoot American citizens, almost all of whom were protesting peacefully. He makes a statement in the Rose Garden outside the White House, and then leads White House officials very close to St. John's Episcopal Church, where he does not make a speech, but he simply stands and holds up a Bible. Why do I say this is what white Christian nationalism looks like? One, the Bible and the church are functioning as symbols, props, to hold up his political authority. Why do I interpret it that way? Well, they never asked the rector of the church or the Bishop of Washington, D.C., is it okay if the president takes a photo op at your church? In fact, the next day, the bishop said, no, they never asked. And if they had, we would have said no. He wasn't welcome to do that. So he's using the church. What about the Bible? Widely reported, he did not have a Bible in the White House. He's pretty much known for not reading the Bible. They collected 8 or 10, maybe 12 Bibles, put them on a table, and he tried them out to see which would look most Bible-y in a photo op, right? So that was a successful choice. The Bible and the church, in other words, he has no close tie to either one, but the picture is powerful because it aligns him with those symbols. And somebody is waiting for me to say, I hope, what about race? Right? The context is racial unrest in the United States in an election year. And he is presenting himself as the icon of law and order, in this context, in the name of Christianity, over against black claims for racial justice. Where does Christian nationalism come from? Here I'm referring in particular to a couple of books. One by John Fea, who teaches at Messiah College, teaches American history, is a nationally known historian. You'll see him on TV. Another is brand new by Brian Kaler and Bo Underwood of Word and Way, called Baptizing America. They'll be doing a webinar through Lancaster Theological Seminary next Wednesday, and you can go to our seminary site and log in. I'm moderating it. Bishop Dwayne Royster, who is Executive Director of Faith in Action, will be a panelist as well. You hear some people say America was founded to be a Christian nation. You hear other people say America was founded as a secular, inclusive society. The answer John Fea demonstrates, and John is a conservative evangelical Christian, the answer that John demonstrates is this is an extremely complicated question. What time are we talking about? What colony are we talking about? Are we talking about the colonies or the framing of the Constitution? Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? Founded specifically to be a Christian society by people fleeing the Church of England. What about Rhode Island? Well, the people in Massachusetts were persecuting them, so they fled to Rhode Island and started a colony that didn't do the established church thing. What about the South? Largely Anglican, established church, though most of the people who came over weren't thinking about religion, they were thinking about opportunity. Maryland, lots of Catholics. Pennsylvania, right? Mutts, intentionally created to be a religiously plural society. And so Quakers, Anabaptists of various stripes, some Baptists, Lutherans, Moravians flocked here because they could live with a measure of freedom. Fea argues that at the framing of the Constitution, the framers chose deliberately to reject the notion that the government was a Christian government, or that those who served in the government should even acknowledge Christianity, or even God. The references to religion in the Constitution are freedom to express religion, right? But also no establishment of religion, no government sponsorship of any religious identity, no matter how broadly defined, and also no religious tests for anyone who holds office. Those are three pretty strong statements about building an inclusive society rather than a sectarian one. And as James Madison put it, the reason for doing this is to keep forever from these shores, he said, the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries. I hope someday to write a sentence like that. But what does he mean? Well, he means that only a century before the Constitution, England had suffered a horrible civil war, and a monarch had been beheaded. What about the rest of Europe? Well, that would be 2 centuries before. And then you're talking about tens of millions of people killed in religious wars. And the founders judged that this was a society that had the kinds of diversity that could create tension if a structure wasn't created. So they did mean to create a government, not a society, but a government that was secular and pluralistic, and in which religion could flourish. One of the odd facts is that when we have government or state religions in the world, religion does not flourish when it has that kind of protection. When you think about Christian nationalists, your first thought might be someone like Mike Pence. Mike Pence comes from what we would call the religious right, moral majority kind of Christianity. I tend to associate the religious right with, well, dark suits and white shirts and boring ties. Jerry Falwell Jr., Franklin Graham, those kinds of figures. There's a sort of denominational, conservative Christianity behind it, and that's what we think about. That movement is still here. But J.D. Vance, who is a senator from Ohio running for vice president, is Roman Catholic. And within Catholicism, he converted specifically to a stream of Catholicism we would identify as scholars as Catholic integralism, which is the idea that government and faith should be united. And so all of the stuff that he has caught flack for over the past few weeks, the childless cat lady thing, is actually an expression of his Christian conviction that women are best off, and society is best off when women are best off in traditional male-female marriages, producing children, and those children grow up and help society flourish and grow. And so he has argued in multiple cases that government should favor people who have children over people who don't have children. That is a religiously held view. It's held also by some on the Protestant Christian right, but it's also held within Roman Catholic Christian nationalism. And the movement that I want to really introduce you to, in this slide is represented in the middle. Steve. Thank you, Steve. No, thank you. I'm not going to give you a hard time ever. Because what could he do to me? But how many of you, I would love to see hands, are familiar with the term New Apostolic Reformation? It is Reformation. You can do it now. That was less than a quarter of you. It's never more than a quarter. This movement is the most energetic force in American Christian nationalism right now. When in 2022 we were in a hot governor's race, right before the election, this awakening tour sponsored by this movement came to Lancaster County. Right before the election. This is a national tour. It's going all over the place, but they emphasize Lancaster. I want to let you know, I'm nobody. I mean this. And as scholars go, I'm nobody. I've had calls from European reporters, the New York Times, the Rolling Stones, and NPR, all wanting to know, doing stories, what's going on in Lancaster County. Okay? At any rate, this movement has been growing for over 30 years. Among white Christians in the United States, it's just about the only growing expression of Christianity. It emerges out of the Pentecostal charismatic movement. It's non-denominational, and I want to introduce you to it. I've known about it for 12 years, but I found out by accident. They had a convention in Lancaster in our convention center downtown. A friend of mine I grew up with in Alabama said, "Hey, I'm coming to Lancaster." I sneaked in, didn't buy a ticket. I lasted 30 minutes, but I had never heard what I was hearing. Okay? The preacher, I'll just give away because he's going to show up again. His name is Che An, and he's a pastor, an apostle in this movement in Pasadena, California. So what are the marks of this movement? It's not a denomination, it's not an organization, it is a series of networks that change all the time that are aligned by apostles, and prophets. And what I mean when I say apostles and prophets, they routinely declare through their authority what God is saying to the church in the world. And I'm in the middle of a research project listening to their sermons. How do they use the Bible? But the answer to what the Bible means is it's been revealed to them. So this is a highly authoritarian movement. Their followers believe, and figures that I will name will have YouTube followings or Facebook followings of 1 million, 2 million people hearing their messages. What I heard in Lancaster 12 years ago was Seven Mountains Dominionism, which is a doctrine in the movement. It has spread widely in evangelicalism beyond, and I'm a former evangelical, so I'm not, and I love Jesus that way. Okay? So this is a movement I can get what's going on. Seven Mountains Dominionism means that Christians should hold dominion over the 7 fundamental pillars of society. I can't recite them, but imagine religion, government, economics, media, family, right? Yes, we'll get to education, yes. They also teach, lots of Christians believe in spiritual warfare, that we're engaged in a struggle against Satan and supernatural forces who are trying to trip us up. They mean strategic spiritual warfare. They believe in territorial spirits. My wife was once told by a friend that she has a spirit of intellectualism. That meant she has a demon. Okay? You will hear language about the spirit of Jezebel being present in the White House or the Capitol, and the need to pull Jezebel out and defeat Jezebel. One example of strategic spiritual warfare in Lancaster was what's called a Jericho march around the public library. Remember the story of Jericho in the Bible? You march around 7 times. At the end of the march, you blow a ram's horn, which is a Jewish thing, and what happens in the story of Jericho? The walls come down. Say that better, Declan. They kill all the people in the city. The idea that they can make declarations of God's will. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they are, if you're into this stuff, they are post-millennialists. Most evangelicals have been premillennialists. What that means is they believe that their work is going to make it possible for Jesus to return. So Matthew Taylor, who has a new book coming out, The Violent Take It by Force, has done, as far as I'm concerned, some of the most cutting-edge research on involvement of the New Apostolic Reformation in the January 6th insurrection. And he writes that independent charismatic leaders who 20 years ago would have been mocked by mainstream religious right leaders are now frontline captains in the American culture wars. Think of all the, go ahead, Steve. Think of all those pictures of preachers laying hands on Donald Trump. Almost all of them are New Apostolic Reformation prophets and apostles. We'll just skip it. On one occasion last year, you can Google this term, a group of their apostles issued what they called a watchman decree, which is several paragraphs long, please, Steve, where when they decree as apostles, they mean they are declaring the spiritual power that will make the things they say happen. And their followers believe that, okay? We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in the 7 mountains. One of the key figures in the movement, Steve, is a guy named Lance Wallnau, happens to be based in Pennsylvania, I believe, who 13 years ago said, you don't want to go out in public and use the language of taking dominion over everybody. We'll use that language inside, but it doesn't play well outside. And so you will rarely hear the leaders of this movement own what they're doing in public. Pastor Jesse just recently shared with me this BuzzFeed story where a woman who is in the movement talks about it. She said, they have prophets. You're trained to take them at their word. These people are highly appointed and anointed by God, Steve. There's a world created in that system where you don't question prophets. And you don't go against what the prophets are saying because they are the literal voice of God coming to us. Her name's Rihanna Teixeira. That is a movement that is inherently authoritarian and top-down because it depends on the decrees of these leaders who align with one another and agree with each other. 8 days before the January 6th attack on the Capitol, 12 to 15 of these apostles and prophets had a 2-hour meeting in the White House. When they left, a couple of them made the mistake of talking about it because they couldn't help bragging. Hey, we were there for 2 hours and we had important strategic conversations. After the 2020 election, and I have a picture of Speaker of the House Mike Johnson here because he participated. They had national prayer calls to conduct spiritual warfare so that the results of the election would be overturned, but it was really a way of getting hundreds of thousands of people involved in the attempt to overturn the election. Mike Johnson was a part of that. That he has an appeal to heaven flag, are you aware of this story, hanging outside his office in the Capitol. That flag was promoted by an apostle named Dutch Sheets 10 years ago. It is a Revolutionary War flag, and what it means, it has a tree, it's white, has a tree, says appeal to heaven. When ordinary efforts won't work, you appeal to heaven. That is, you go to war and leave it up to God. On January the 6th, there were 6 protest permits issued. 4 went to New Apostolic Reformation figures. And on January the 5th, there was a rally in which Cheon, I mentioned him, right? Coming to Lancaster 12 years ago, said, I believe that this week we're going to throw Jezebel out. And Jehu, the Israelite king who killed Jezebel, Jehu's going to rise up, and we're going to rule and reign through President Trump and under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Right? That's what they mean by dominion. There's no gap between Jesus and them, and no gap between them and President Trump. We're going to rule and reign. Right now, that movement is conducting, just Google it, what are called courage rallies that are presented as spiritual revivals, but in which the speakers call people to sign up to become election workers. And they had 2,000 people in a tent in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. 2,000. I want you to imagine 50 of them. Just imagine, I'm making this up, not the 2,000, but the 50. 50 of them sign up to be election workers in various counties in Michigan. The election will be close. Suppose of those 50, 20 say, I saw something squirrely. Do you remember 2021? Do you remember December of 2020? How long it took to resolve the election results? And even then, Congress couldn't do it, right? That's what this is about. There is a meeting for Pennsylvania clergy in Lancaster on the 18th, all day, sponsored in part by Power Interfaith, by the Council on American Islamic Relations, and I'm forgetting, the acronym is RAC, but the Leadership Structure of Reform Judaism, to train clergy to help prepare people for election subversion. Register, volunteer to be a nonpartisan election worker or poll watcher, which is partisan, because this process is not waiting on the election, it is happening now. and its heart is the New Apostolic Reformation. Well, let's skip one. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about how the movement works. And in this part of the presentation, I want to talk about social attitudes. So this is largely the work of sociologists and political scientists who do a lot of survey work and analysis of surveys, statistical analysis, and so forth. And what I'm going to argue is that Christian nationalists, people who identify with the kinds of beliefs I said earlier, found as a Christian nation, should be a Christian nation, should have Christian symbols, right? Should have Christian laws according to a certain kind. They have a very distinctive profile in terms of their social attitudes. And when I say white, the two groups farthest apart in their social attitudes on many key issues are Christian groups. Way out here, white evangelicals. Way over here, black Protestants. Steve? Robert P. Jones, who wrote White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, former Southern Baptist like me, is a sociologist now, except he's famous. But he argues, imagine these two groups, black Protestants and white evangelicals, they believe almost all the same things theologically. They live in the same areas. Like where I grew up, North Alabama, living in the same area, same town, not same neighborhood. And yet their political attitudes are, if it's measured by religion, the farthest apart in the country. You might be sitting here and you might think, well, I'm Presbyterian or Methodist or Lutheran or United Church of Christ or Episcopalian or Roman Catholic. I'm not like that. Well, the white evangelicals are here, white mainline Protestants are here, white Catholics are in between, black Protestants are still here. What Jones says is the more we white Christians go to church, the more racist we become. I might put it a little softer. I would say, statistically speaking, the more we go to church, the more alienated we are from our black sisters and brothers. And we need to figure out what that's about. So what are these tendencies? This is where I move fast, Steve. People who align with Christian nationalist outlook are more likely than other Americans to demand respect for national symbols and traditions, right? The whole standing for the national anthem thing, Pledge of Allegiance things, flag things, that sort of thing. They are more likely to be suspicious of racial and religious minorities and especially suspicious of immigrants. That's why you're hearing about immigrants all the time right now. They're more likely to attribute racial inequality. And what that term really means is, let's imagine the differences in outcomes in education, life expectancy, health care, infant mortality, right? This spectrum of social measures in which the most disadvantaged people in the United States are black and brown, they're more likely to say that those gaps are due to the shortcomings of minority groups rather than historical discrimination or structural factors in our society than other Americans are. When their story of racialized police violence, they distrust the stories coming from people of color, that there's racial inequality in the criminal justice system. We'll talk about this more in a minute. They're more likely than other Americans to support restrictive voting measures. This is one that will catch your attention. They tend to believe that whites and Christians are the most persecuted groups in America. I'll tell you why. If you grow up in an evangelical Christian context, you will be told that you're being persecuted all the time. Maybe you're in high school and you don't go to the party where there's alcohol and the other kids pick on you. That counts for persecution. Maybe you're that landlord and the law says, no, you have to rent that property to the same-sex couple, that counts as persecution. See? They're more likely than other Americans to oppose scientists and science education. This is why COVID was so easy to weaponize. This is why it's difficult for climate science to make progress, right? This is why the work of psychologists and other social scientists is devalued. And I'm going to talk about this in some detail next. For 70 years, Christian nationalism has been deeply tied to the attempt to undermine public education. And that's why we're seeing chaos in our public schools in central Pennsylvania, at the school board level especially. So I want to talk about how it works with respect to public education. D. James Kennedy, famous pastor from Florida, has said that the modern public education system was begun in an effort to deliver children from the Christian religion. I don't know if Thaddeus Stevens thought that or not. David Barton, who speaks all over the country and has funding in the many millions of dollars to argue for Christian nationalism, has called schools the enemy of the country. Florida passed legislation to replace school chaplains school counselors who have education degrees and training in human development and psychology and family dynamics and social work, to replace them with chaplains who have almost none of that, right? Texas following suit, legislation in Pennsylvania to accomplish that. Next slide, we can skip it because that's Pennsylvania. Let me put it this way, and I was talking with a public school superintendent this weekend about this, who confirmed what I was saying. For a while, it's, are you teaching that white people are meaner than other people when you teach American history? Right? In other words, are you teaching the history of slavery and segregation and discrimination? Then it'll be, do you have, in fact, when I saw her, I said, I heard there was porn in your car. She thought it was funny. What I mean is, a book in the school library that depicts same-sex parents in a school board meeting is being described as pornography. Right? Okay, it's that. Are you using critical race theory? Or are you promoting diversity and equity and inclusion? That's an issue. COVID and masking was an issue. Parental choice. School vouchers, right? They want state funds to go to private schools. All of these things, they just one after the other, because very highly paid people are figuring out trans students, oh my dear goodness, and bathrooms and sports. Somebody is figuring out how to get their volunteers agitated so that they will show up at school board meetings and make it nearly impossible to run business. It's a nationally coordinated effort. It's funded in tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And the reality is that a very few people who are highly motivated can overwhelm a system when most people aren't paying attention. I want to single out Pastor Jesse North for paying attention in Lancaster County. Also, democracy. One of the founders of the Christian homeschool movement, a guy named John Rushdoony, going back to the 50s, but in an interview during the 70s said, if democracy exalts man or humankind to the place of God, and the will of man to the place of God, it will fail, and it is failing today. He said that like 40 years ago, that democracy is failing. Bill Moyers said, you think democracy has substituted what for the kingdom of God? His answer was, the will of the majority. Christian nationalism has always tried to create a situation in which a minority of Americans governs the rest of the society. Now, in some ways, I will say every political movement in some way tries to out-leverage its weight, right? That's true. But to understand that this critique of democracy is present, and it's why right now so many public figures are saying maybe it's time to pass on democracy. Next slide, please. Paul Weyrich, one of the founders of the old moral majority religious right, said, many of our Christians want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. All those laws meant to make it harder to vote, right? You're voting by mail, but you fail to sign the outside of the envelope, right? Counties closing voting offices where there's a disproportionate part of the population that's Hispanic, Latinx, or black, right? But easier for white parts of the county to vote. One of their intellectuals, a guy named Eric Hubeck, said the movement will be entirely destructive, also constructive. We're not trying to reform the institutions that are present. We want to destroy them and replace them with our own. He goes on to say, we're going to use guerrilla tactics. We don't want them to know what we're doing. We want to undermine the legitimacy of the dominant regime. We could have every member of the movement put a bumper sticker on the car that says something to the effect of, public education is rotten, homeschool your kids. And I know you're hearing a lot now about the Project 2025 plan. Project 2025 was headed by the Heritage Foundation, but if you read the document, which is 900 pages long, so am I telling the truth if I told you I read the document? I'm lying. I scanned it and I read the executive summary, and I read the part on the executive branch of the government. But the other partners include several Christian nationalist organizations that I've listed here. A man named Russ Vought, who ran budget management for the Trump administration, wrote the part on the executive branch, and he has publicly called for Christian nationalism to run the country. We can skip the, oh, you're on it, so good. We can move on. To get some sense, this is what the statisticians do, and so I have to do this, so I'm looking the same way you are. This chart is, from left to right, is on a series of 6 survey questions conducted every year by Baylor University. How strongly people's answers to those 6 questions identify them with a Christian nationalist outlook. 6 questions, you can get up to 4 points for each question, so you can score up to 24 points. That's the far right end of the scale. The far left end is me, right, where I'm getting zeros on the questions. I'm not quite a 0, actually, but I'm close. And the question that they're graphing this chart onto is, do you consider voting a privilege rather than a right? Notice that if people don't align with the Christian nationalist outlook, about 10% of Americans regard, if voting is a privilege, you can require people to do things to vote, right? Pass a test, pay money, have a clean criminal record. Over 50% of people who score strongly Christian nationalists think voting is a privilege. And this is why, if you ever have conversation with someone you know, and you're saying all these voter suppression laws are just making it harder to vote, and it's not that they'll argue with you so much, they won't understand why you're bothered by it, right? They're sincere. They just don't think everybody has a right to vote. and maybe needs to prove that they should. The threat to democracy in Christian nationalism goes beyond voting to the kind of violence we saw on January the 6th. We do have political violence in the United States, right? Elected officials get threatened. Paul Pelosi almost got murdered. A judge's daughter was murdered when she opened the door of the house. When we planned this event, and I said where I was coming, my wife said, "What about security?" And then I got a note from Pastor Jesse about security. The head of the Heritage Foundation, which spearheaded Project 2025, said, "We're in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left lets it be." Robert Jones, who I mentioned earlier, sociologist, right? What they do is they take two questions and they sort of mash up who responds which ways to these questions. So here are the two things they wanted to see if people would affirm. One, God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians. So you get Christian nationalists, right? America is a promised land for Christians. And you get a little dose of racism in there too with the European Christians bit, right? That's one. The other is true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. To violence. What he found was that people who tend to agree with the first one about European Christians, 43% could imagine political violence being a necessary solution to our country's problems, as opposed to 10% of people who disagreed with that statement. So when you hear these Christian preachers, and they do it all the time, talking about spiritual warfare, slide, don't take it just metaphorically. Last summer, I was invited to participate in a debate in Lancaster County. I didn't. But they didn't tell me the name of the event, which was The Gospel at War. And notice the cross, right? It's a sword. Great book from last year, Brad Onishi's Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism. Onishi starts the book with, I don't want to take too much time because I'm getting toward the time I allotted myself, but he says, if I had stayed in the church that I joined in high school, would I have been present invading the Capitol on January the 6th? And the answer he gave himself was, probably. He does a podcast that's doing very well called Straight White American Jesus. In a recent podcast, a guy named Charlie Kirk, that you don't hear about unless you're really plugged into this stuff, but a person of enormous national influence, and some of his bros were talking about the people who conducted investigations and prosecutions of Donald Trump. They should all be, they agreed, publicly executed, and children should be made to watch. And then they fantasized about what kind of execution we should pull off, and spent a little time on guillotine before they moved on. Violence is part of the imagination of the movement, and it has a history of turning into actual violence. Violence isn't just on America's right, it is primarily on America's right, according to the FBI. One other dimension I want to mention, and then I want to talk about how we as Christians might respond. What I want to name is that there's an international dimension of Christian nationalism. One of the key figures funding Christian nationalism in the United States and receiving visitors from the United States is Viktor Orban of Hungary. I was gifted by Power Interfaith with the chance to visit Hungary with a group of pro-democracy activists to study people trying to save Hungary's democracy last year. The European Parliament has declared them no longer a functioning democracy. They keep changing the rules on elections, always talking about immigrants, always talking about LGBT people. States in the United States are getting laws from Hungary. It's no accident that CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, an American organization, held its meeting in Budapest, or that Orban came back across the ocean to be the keynote speaker in Dallas, or that he visited President Trump, or that, did you hear the one global political leader Donald Trump praised last night? Hungary, Orban says, is a Christian nation. He means European. 11% of Hungarians go to church. Average per capita GDP in Hungary is about $18,000 because it is so corrupt. Countries that were poorer, like Lithuania, Estonia, Slovenia, doing much better than Hungary, even they had much farther to go in progressing. But that's constantly who you will hear about in this movement as the model. You can skip the next one. But it's not just Hungary, it's Russia, but you can't say Russia now because of the war in Ukraine. They align. Bolsonaro and his movement in Brazil. Netanyahu, Jewish nationalism. Modi in India, Hindu nationalism. And these leaders will always align. Ann Applebaum has a new book called Autocracy, which is about these networks of anti-democratic leaders and how they protect each other. How should we respond? I would argue that Christian nationalism misses the way of Jesus. I'm not telling you it's not Christian. Everything they do, Christians have done before. I'm not going to say they're not Christian. I'm going to say I think they're wrong in fundamental, dangerous ways. One is they treat Jesus as a brand. And I know this because I'm listening to their preaching and watching their literature. They talk about Christian identity, but do they talk about blessed are the poor? Do they talk about the rich man and Lazarus or the Good Samaritan? Do they talk about feeding everybody and healing everybody? Do they talk about loving your enemies, or do they talk about conducting strategic spiritual warfare? Right? Jesus is a brand. For us, he needs to be the way. We need to model after him. Next, please. When they talk about freedom, they mean freedom to do what they want to do and run the country according to their preferences. The Gospels and Paul talk about freedom as the opportunity to be free from sin so that we can serve God and love our neighbor. We need to find Christian freedom, not a certain kind of consumerist, I can do what I want freedom. One more. The language of dominion is not the language Jesus used. He said, don't be like the Gentiles who try to dominate, but rather try to find ways to serve. I don't trust another Christian, not even want to. We got a bunch of Lancaster Seminary people in the room. Not even want to govern this country on the basis of his Christian identity. And you know why? Because all of us, even Muat, are subject to sin and corruption. And so throughout the church, we're finding wave after wave in places we didn't know, including recently the New Apostolic Reformation, of sexual abuse being institutionalized. We, at one point, thought, oh, those Roman Catholics. Whoops. No, anytime somebody has that kind of unquestioned authority, abuse happens. Right? So they're not willing to examine themselves. They say, if we were in charge, everything would be right because we're Christians. We Christians have a long record of being in power. We don't have a long record of being right. Next slide, please. They want to blend Jesus and Caesar. Jesus said, give Caesar the things that are Caesar's and God the things that are God's. They want those to be one thing. Read that passage in Mark. What Jesus means is Caesar says he owns everything, including you. What does God own? Everything, including you. And so it's idolatrous to blur faithfulness to Jesus with a particular government, nation, or political ideology. We need to be able to critique Christian nationalism on the grounds that it is bad Christianity, dangerous Christianity, anti-democratic, divisive Christianity. One more slide. What about you personally? I'm going to dwell on this for a minute. What should you be doing? The first thing I would call you to do is guard your soul. I mean this sincerely. I feel stressed by the state of our country. I feel angry or close to it all the time. Many of you are nodding. I feel suspicion and division. And if I want to be able to live in a way that is healthy for me, healthy for my family, healthy for the people I interact with, I need to draw close to those things that give me resilience and kindness and softness and flexibility. Is it meditation? Is it the dog? Is it the children or your partner or activities you're involved in? Is it Mass every day or every Sunday? Whatever it is, you're not ready for this. We're not ready for this unless we are tending to our spirits. We can't be acting out of anger and fear and resentment. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to really stress this stuff about guarding your soul. You have to be vigilant. That means it's not good enough to say, oh, I'm happy, I don't want to be bothered watching. Well, don't watch the news. Lord, don't watch the news. Don't watch anybody's news. But read it. Read the local news. Find sources of information you can trust. Christian nationalism has been at work locally and more effective locally than it's been nationally all over the country and in states. So you have to be vigilant. Stay alert, gather the information. And it's not enough right now to just say, well, I'll vote. If you have the capacity, you need to be organized because the people who want to end this democracy are highly, highly funded and highly organized. The founder of the Federalist Society, that's been responsible for appointing the Supreme Court justices, just received $1 billion in funding this year. Billion. And the only way to counter that is to work together, sign up, volunteer, knock on doors. Again, if you're a conservative, thank God for you. You are so important because you have extra power in your circles of influence. We have to organize, and we can't say, oh, I'm too busy. This is the only time I'm going to brag. It's the 10th. I have 10 more of these presentations this month. I have a full-time job and a part-time job. I'm a little punchy. Treat people as people. Don't get into ugly interactions. Okay? If someone is hurting someone else, then yes, you can put yourself between them, and if you have to be aggressive about it, I get that, right? Because there are people being targeted and victimized, and you might have to be tough. Otherwise, don't insult, don't demean, don't mock, not even on social media unless it's a really good cat lady joke. I actually did one this morning. I saw a guy this morning who was walking his dog, and I thought, how brave. But seriously, you want to interact with people in kindness. You want to listen to them. Don't receive abuse. Be willing to walk away. And finally, then what do I do if I'm not arguing with them? Let me ask you this. When was the last time you said something so smart that somebody said, oh, all my life I've been wrong? But what you can do is, and this is language from the black church tradition and evangelical traditions, you can testify. And what I mean by testify is just share from your experience in your life. Like testifying sounds like, what are your core values? One of mine is, I want every kid to get the same quality education my grandson's getting. I want to live in a society where everyone has dignity and full rights. I want to live in a society where we find room for everybody and can resolve our differences together. I want to live in a society where we figure out how to solve problems together and actually do something rather than just fight. I just want to live in this. You're dreaming out loud, right? And it's really hard to shoot somebody down when they're testifying. And all you're doing is opening that space. That's all you can accomplish, is to open that space where they might think, oh, this person isn't so bad. They're not the enemy. They're not worth killing. Guard your soul. Watch and organize. Maintain human relationships. Practice testifying and do it. So I think I'm right on time because we started a little late, but I'll let our facilitators tell us how much time we really have. But if you have questions, this is a good time to scribble them down, and we'll field them. While they're doing that, we have some folks who already have them. So, Jesse, right behind you, there are questions. Oh. Wow, it's a lot. We'll be lucky. Excuse me. Do you want me to hand them to you? Do you want me to ask them? I'd rather you ask them and just look at them. Yeah. And we got any kind of little out. It won't take long. Are y'all taking turns? Is that how? You can start with that one. You can introduce Matt. Okay. Is this from Matt Linehan?
No, it's not from Matt. I'm saying you can.
Oh.
That's a great question to introduce Matt from. Because he's part of the answer to the
Sorry. What local groups do you suggest connecting with first, and how can we help spread the message beyond testifying? I do volunteer for the group, one of the groups that's sponsoring this event, Power Interfaith, which is a state grassroots organizing interfaith group, started in Philadelphia but has expanded out this way. And the coordinator in Lancaster County is the Reverend Dr. Matt Linehan, who is right here. So I bet he'll stand around and be happy to talk with you. Could we put the next slide that just has that QR code? And how can we help spread the message? I will say, being in an organized group is a good way to help spread the message. If it means carrying signs or something like that, or knocking on doors, that's good too. But one thing, if you have the capacity, it's stunning how much of a difference letters to the editor make, if they're well written. During our campaigns in Lancaster County, I got a prominent Republican to write a letter to the editor, talking about our school board races. And of course, that gave him extra clout, and he heard a lot about it, and that was all very good. Do we have a next one?
Yep. I'll read it.
Yeah. I can put my glasses on again.
Am I on? Can you hear me? Pennsylvania requires schools to dismiss students for religious education if parents give consent. When the majority of the kids in a class opt to go with friends, this seems like an insidious way for Christian nationalists to make inroads in public schools. What can parents do to prevent this? It doesn't seem like schools are vetting these programs.
Well, schools aren't vetting the programs because it's been decided that Christian groups and other religious groups have the right to do them, okay? And it just so happens that the groups that do them, at least in Lancaster County, are Christian nationalist groups. And my grandson was like, Mom, there's this group, they do cool things, and my friends go. And I explained to her what the group was, and she looked it up. I mean, they have a website. They tell you what they're trying to do. And think about the influence that happens when a child says, I'm not going. And in the case of my grandson, he said, I don't want to go. Because the group has anti-LGBT stuff in it, in its literature. That is a way to resist it, but they do have a right to do it, as I understand it.
Are you able to explain the interpretation of the Revelation scripture that the Christian nationalists call the Seven Mountains passage?
Oh, I didn't know that's how they were doing it. Yes. So in Revelation 17, you get the image of a prostitute wearing fine garments and jewelry, riding a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And commentators routinely identify both of these symbols with Roman imperial commerce and domination. So, the riding, they're intimately connected, the commerce and domination. Rome was known as the city on 7 hills. So this is not a passage about how Christians should take dominion over 7 mountains of culture. It's actually a critique about imperial dominion of the ancient Mediterranean world.
Do you think the Christian nationalist movement matches the preferences, or proficiencies, something found on the Church of Laodicea, the 7th church in Revelation? Now, what the audience doesn't know is that Greg writes commentaries on Revelation. So now we're in a actual area. He'd call himself an expert.
So the Church of Laodicea is supposed to be lukewarm, isn't it? I'll just say this about Revelation, if there are other questions about it. Revelation was meant to address the circumstances of Christians living in Western Turkey, we would call it now, in the 1st century. It was not meant to predict events 20 centuries later. And at the beginning and end of the book, it repeatedly insists these are the things that are happening soon or now. And I'll just stop there.
Do we know how many people consider themselves Christian nationalists?
Great question. A lot of the people who would be defined by survey data as Christian nationalists would say, what's a Christian nationalist? They might say, yes, I am, or no, I'm not. In fact, polling data suggests that or at least a few years ago, before we started calling attention to the movement more intensively, over half of American Christians would have measured out as sympathetic to or supportive of Christian. If you ask them something like, would you like to be America to be a Christian nation? A lot of Americans would say yes. If you ask them, would you like to have prayer in school? You're going to get a decent percentage who are going to say yes. That's different than being part of a movement, right? And so it is very hard to pin down the specific numbers. But let me just say this about American elections, the past 2 presidential elections, when you're talking about 150,000 votes or 140,000 votes, and the basic decision comes down to 250,000 of those, they are razor thin over a long period of time, national elections, right? This is going back at least to the 2000 election. And so even if the movement is, let's say, 20 million, that's a big block in our politics.
A friend prays for a return to constitutional republic not democracy. There's not really a question attached to that, but just a statement.
Yes.
Maybe you can reflect on it.
Yes. Oh, I've reflected on it. It is a common talking point in American politics for someone to say, we weren't founded as a democracy, we were founded to be a republic. And under that is sort of, then society shouldn't be governed by the will of the people. It should be people we elect, and then we elect them and they have that authority. The difference between a republic and a democracy is simply this. You can't have every American, or couldn't in 1776 anyway, every American voting on every issue all the time. That would be democracy like in Greece, in a Greek city. So you have a republic, but how did we define it? By the people, of the people, for the people. Abraham Lincoln. Throughout American history, the language of republican democracy has been interchangeable, but this is a word game to try to limit our demands for democracy. So just tell them that, right? Of the people, by the people, for the people.
So what types of specific questions can we ask those who are seeking office to see where they stand? And what should we be looking for in their answers?
Oh, wow, that is a great question. What could you ask someone running for office? You could ask them a very specific symbolic question. Should we have prayer in public schools? You will get a pretty quick answer there. You could ask them, do you think America was founded to be a Christian society? Those are the most straight to the point kinds of questions, because a lot of politicians have been trained to say, I'm not a Christian nationalist. A lot of preachers have been trained to say they're not Christian. Just like we just read Lance Wallnow saying that. So you want to get
I'm not a Christian nationalist, Greg.
Yeah. And you've proven it, but so you would want to get at those kinds of symbolic things. If they supported, do you think Christians should have the right to not offer business services to people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender expression?
There are several questions on this sheet, or in this particular card. How can they explain their actions being in line with any teachings of the church? I'm sure that's a Presbyterian, because we have no problem with any of this.
Right. Well, and the thing about this Brian Kaler, Bo Underwood book is they point out that Christian nationalism is not just an evangelical thing. It's across the span of Christianity. And it's present in most churches, but the difference is some churches promote it and other churches don't. Not enough churches are resisting it. I just talked long enough to kind of forget the question.
How can they explain their actions being in line with any teachings of the church?
So you could go online and listen to, on YouTube, I think it's called Take 15 with Dutch Sheets. Every morning he does a 15-minute devotional. And you can listen to it because what he's trying to convince Christians of is that these are the fundamental things that it means to be Christian. And, they basically amount to things like dominion, being anti-gay, big, right? He won't be talking about mercy. He won't be talking about inclusion. He won't be talking about social justice. So what they're doing is they're emphasizing parts of the Bible that have those themes, and they do. And not emphasizing the parts of the Bible. Really, what you will not hear much of, almost none, is the kinds of teachings and behaviors we associate with Jesus. Mm-hmm. They'll talk about Jesus. They won't talk about the Jesus I recognize. But in their minds, I want to be clear, they're faithful to Jesus.
What about the separation of church and state?
So, the language of separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. And Christian nationalist thought leaders will say it was never intended to be a part of our society. Even though James Madison and Thomas Jefferson used that language outside of the Constitution. What separation of church and state means in the Constitution is freedom of religion, right, in the First Amendment, which also means freedom from religion. No establishment of religion, which means the government does not promote religion of any kind, and no religious test for office holders. That's what they meant by the wall of separation between church and state. And I shared the reasons for that. But they are arguing that separation of church and state is a made-up idea. And that instead, this country was and should be Christian. Every once in a while, you'll find a Christian nationalist thought leader who will say, the Constitution is flawed. But I want to share, and I'm not picking on her. She's an example of a conservative who is resisting the attempt to end democracy, right? Liz Cheney, who was a member of Congress. According to Kaler and Underwood, I'm sure their sources are something else, but Liz Cheney on the January 6th committee in Congress didn't want the report about January 6th to include Christian nationalism. It would have included a section on the influence of Christian nationalism in the attempt to overturn the election and the assault on the Capitol. And the reason she gave, was she didn't want the document to smear Christianity because she is a pious Christian. It's unclear whether she also wanted to argue that she thinks America should be a Christian nation, it's just that they got it wrong. But in her remarks, she has said that the Constitution is divinely inspired, which is one you could ask and get an indication if someone's a Christian nationalist. Now, that's a pretty new idea. Mormons typically regard the Bible, the Constitution, as divinely inspired, by the way. But Protestant and Catholic Christians do not. It's been amended 20, what? But anyway, so when we talk about this constitutional issue and the language of separation in church and state, I'm just pointing out how convoluted it can get in a society where most of us grew up, if we went to church, seeing flags in the sanctuary and singing patriotic hymns on January the 4th. Most of us expect candidates for... Greg. As I've gotten older, that's the thing I do. I say the word I don't mean to say, and I'm starting to worry. That's not a joke. Anyway, it's really not. So it becomes really complicated, and we have to be clear what we mean by separation of church and state is a constitution that intentionally founded a non-sectarian, pluralistic government. It's just that simple.
Do you want to take one more question?
Is it? We maybe have time for like one question that you've thought of during the Q&A time. Is there anybody that's got something they just can't stand to leave without asking?
Where do you teach?
What do I teach?
Where are you a professor?
Oh, Lancaster Theological Seminary. This is your, yeah, there's about 8 or 9 of them in here. Be careful. This is my 26th year there.
Go ahead, Matt.
What does it look like to be Christian and patriotic, in my opinion? I love that question. And I would even argue that being patriotic in part is an expression of my Christianity, in part. So in the larger sense, in the ultimate sense, our citizenship as Christians is not to a specific country, right? The life of a Vietnamese child is no less value than the life of an American child in a Christian perspective. But patriotic means I'm here, and I want this country to flourish, and I will work and sacrifice and invest for it to flourish. Which is one reason that I don't mind taxes to the degree that they are investing in the flourishing of society, and get mad when they're being abused. That's what patriotism means to me. I love the country and care about it and want what's best for it. When our society is healthier than it is now, my patriotism is a little louder. But, you know, I grew up in North Alabama surrounded by people who had fought in Vietnam and Korea and Europe and the Pacific. And I'm thinking about the people who were my grandparent figures and shaped me. And those things matter to me. I'm fine claiming being patriotic. I will say, someone who wants to dominate the rest of us, someone who says our society is decadent and corrupt, someone who wants to end democracy, is not a patriot. And I'll even, while I'm ranting, and I'm sorry to do this to you, it was not fair. Watching my language. Who the heck thought it was a good idea to alter the flag of the United States in their symbolic representation? Do you hear the Alabamian in me? Right? When I see those, I say, that's not patriotic. Because what you're trying to do is use that as leverage to dominate the rest of us. So I thank you. It was a great question. I hope I gave a decent answer. And I would just want to say, because we're closing, thank you all. I did ask for a lot of time, and you came out, and that's a sacrifice. I'm grateful. If I can be helpful, let me know. Thank you.
Friends, we want to thank you all for coming this evening. If you are interested in organizing any groups, Matt is here from Power Interfaith Lancaster. Thank you again for coming and for your questions, and thank you, Dr. Carey. Please join us in the cafe for refreshments and some snacks. Stick around and chat as long as you'd like. Thank you again. Good night.